So let's take some of this full circle back to the warning posed by Thomas Jefferson when he stated in 1811, "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. That if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation." Here's where we hit it right now. "The banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all their property and until their children wake up homeless on the very continent that their forefathers created." The banks and the corporations that grow up around it. Now, that was never discussed very specifically in the Federalist Papers and in Federalist number 10, but when you think about it, if you have 13 individual nation states, sovereign nation states that are able to protect their own borders, create their own trade policy, have their own tax policy, protect their own borders, there are some advantages to creating a continental-sized government. But in the long run, the disadvantages would be that you're able not to protect yourself from international financial influences. In other words, the corporations now can create something we would call Wall Street. And this would be part of an international market that can insert itself into the many states or all of the states. So it's the corporation that would be allowed to penetrate into the states. When we think of the British East India Trading Company, that was the ultimate corporation that we've already suggested. Cornwallis was in charge of creating India, or the Corporation of India, the corporation or the political construction of Ireland. And he was right here and present with the construction of the United States of America. So that British East Indian Company, through the abstractive arguments made in Federalist number 10 and the creation of a federal government, each of the state borders and their sovereignty would deteriorate. They could not protect themselves from the East Indian Company and the other corporations surrounding it that would now be able to freely penetrate all of the people's, communities, economies of the United States as a whole. So when we look at the power and influence of the federal government over the last 200 years, we have to see it in relationship to the growth of Wall Street and the influence of money and the expansion of the corporation in the 19th and into the 20th century with this class of people that we call the establishment class or the power elite. Especially we see them projected into the international realm after the Civil War with the advance of the corporation and the advance of the railroads. They would become the titans of industry, the robber barons, as you would. And these oligarchical classes related to the other oligarchical classes of the world would now be firmly implanted into the economies not only of the individual states, but would be steering the manufacturing giant that is the United States. And of course, there's a two-sided story to this. There was a lot of wealth and prosperity that was created for the many, but the long-term plan of this project is the United States manufacturing power would be able to influence the direction of world events toward the creation of this world federation. And yes, I am saying that Hamilton and Jefferson both worked for the British East Indian Company. They both worked for the Rothschild dynasty, and they were both very much yin and yang, a controlled dialectic that would bring the United States toward this federated form of government through the argument of Federalist number 10 and allow private banks to control the money supply of the United States and ultimately the destiny of the United States. So despite the apparent resistance from Jefferson, from Jackson, from Lincoln, from Garfield, from McKinley, arguably from Eisenhower and Kennedy. Despite that resistance, we see a steady movement toward power, toward the federal government, away from the states and toward the federal government, and now away from our federal government and toward the interest of international finance and those agencies associated with it. So this has been this segment on Dr. Deep State. So thank you for joining Dr. Deep State.